This is Afternoons with Tim Webster
on ABC Radio Sydney.
Yes, you're probably familiar with the story, but the 4 spears taken by British Naval Lieutenant James Cook and his crew on their first contact with Australia have been returned to their community after more than 250 years. Now, they're known as the Gweagal spears. They were taken in 1770 by the Endeavour. The Endeavour arrived in Botany Bay in their first meeting between British and Indigenous Gweagal people of Kamay. Now, you know the story, but I just wanted to flesh it out a little bit more because I just think it's a fascinating story, and I love all of this history. I love history, full stop. So I've got Dr. Iain Stuart on the line to have a chat about it. He knows all about these sort of things, artefacts especially. G'day, Dr. Stuart.
How are you, Tim?
I'm great. Look, do my listeners need to know, because I need to know, what I'm reading, these artefacts are extremely significant indeed. I'm talking about the spears now, yeah?
Yes, they are very significant. They represent really the first encounter between the Europeans and the Aboriginal people of Kamay, the Gweagal people.
Yeah.
And they're, the current ancestors of the people there, the elders resisted the arrival of the British in their boats.
Yeah.
And of course they were warned off by the British firing shots. One Aboriginal person was wounded. And then the British came on land and went to their huts. And they knew they were stealing stuff. They said they didn't think in the circumstances it wasn't wrong, but they took about 40 spears and maybe a shield, and they left goods in exchange, which they later found the Aboriginal people hadn't touched.
Right.
And they took these spears back as part of their collections.
Okay, now we saw, I think, 4 on television. Are they the only ones, or are they more?
They're the only ones that have been able to be traced.
Okay.
When they got back to the UK, the collection, which was really Joseph Banks and the Admiralty, the collection was dispersed amongst various museums.
You're right.
And they just seem to have been lost.
Yeah, wow. That's a very good point, Dr. Stuart, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but James Cook a lot of blame is laid at his feet, but a hell of a lot wasn't him, was it? It was everybody else on the ship, including Banks.
Well, I think Banks has to be seen in this context of this particular time. He's collecting animals, he's collecting birds, he's collecting vegetation, and so he's collecting Aboriginal people's artefacts, just as if they were, animals and objects to be collected. That's the way people viewed Aboriginal people at that time, and that's why their items were taken to a museum, and that's why the myth of Terra Nullius was developed as well.
Yeah.
That is that the Aboriginal people really didn't own the land, but they clearly did, and they clearly resisted the Europeans arriving.
Yeah. Looking at the spears on television, I thought the ones with the 4 prongs at the end are obviously for fishing, but and what about the others? What were they generally used for by our Indigenous people?
I think they were. I think fishing is really, in that area, was really common. I think that subsequent records, every picture of Sydney, Port Jackson, shows some Aboriginal person in a little boat with fishing spears, not surprisingly because it's obviously a lot of fish, but spears are used for other things. They're often used, obviously, for larger mammals and also for fighting and for rituals and things like that. So there's a variety of different spears. And the archaeologists have been particularly interested in the spears because, of course, what survives 3,000 years ago is only stone, so we have no organic material. So we have to look at modern examples to see whether there are any changes or how things were made 3,000, 20,000 years ago.
Yeah, was it Banks who took them to Trinity College, to the museum there back in 1771? Was it him?
I think it was the Admiralty as well.
Okay, right,
Banks and the Admiralty worked together. I think the name Lord Sandwich appears, and he seems to have donated them to between Trinity College and the British Museum, but there are other artefacts that Banks held in his collection that were distributed amongst scientific colleagues of his.
Yeah.
But the ones we're talking about ended up at Trinity College, Cambridge.
Yeah, I think what I'm saying about Cook is, primarily, he was in charge, but primarily he was the adventurer and the sailor, and a very good sailor, indeed, very good navigator. But it was Banks, as you say, that was responsible for collecting all of this wonderful material.
Indeed, and Banks obviously had an ongoing involvement in Australia, particularly after the 1788 settlement. He was a sort of grey eminence behind a lot of the decisions made about how to settle Australia, and particularly the sheep industry, which obviously spread across much of the Aboriginal lands once the sheep started to get going. So he's got that sort of, people went and saw him before they were appointed governors.
Yeah.
So he was quite an important person. But he never came back to Australia after that time.
No, that's right. Well, Ray Ingrey, who's a very prominent member of the community in La Perouse, just so the listeners know how important this is, Ray said, "My old people lived in Sydney. I have an ancient and unbroken connection to Sydney. I heard from my elders, particularly my great auntie, who told us of the arrival of the Endeavour. She would talk about the conflict and also some of the artefacts and materials that were taken." So, some more than 250 years on, they're coming back. It's really significant, Dr. Stuart.
It is absolutely significant. And I think it reflects a change, particularly in the areas of archaeology and anthropology, where, 100 years ago, I guess people thought that these items were to be collected and put in museums. But these days, there's much more Aboriginal agency. In fact, Aboriginal agency is primacy. And so, items get reburied, items get repatriated. And, that's just the way it is, because it's Aboriginal people's culture, and it's theirs to do with what they want.
Yeah, and Noeline Timbry from the La Perouse local Aboriginal Land Council visited the spears in 2017, and she's been determined to secure their return ever since. Must be very emotional, because they're finally coming back.
Oh, I think it would be tremendously emotional for people. They're items that, when you think about it, it's their great-grandparents that were involved.
Yeah.
It's not that long ago. And the stories and the connections, just as people talk about their families' experiences with Anzac, these people, the Aboriginal communities, have strong connections with the invasion.
Yeah.
So there's that sort of really emotional thing. And, to take the point that you made at the start of the program, there's a lot of other artefacts that have made their way to museums in Australia and overseas, and also in private collections.
That's what I was going to ask you. Would you have any idea how many? I'm sure it's a hell of a lot.
Well, look, I imagine there's a lot, but I have some figures.
Okay.
A project by the British Museum, backed by the Australian Research Council, found that there are at least 39,000 Indigenous artefacts in around 70 museums in the UK and Ireland. So if you imagine that there's also other museums like France, Germany, Russia, places like that, there would be a considerably greater amount of Aboriginal artefacts. And these were variously collected. There were expeditions to places where they did archaeology. There were people who were buying artefacts from collectors, which is now prohibited. And of course, then there's the whole terrible situation of human remains, where human remains were,
terrible,
particularly skeletal remains, were taken off to be studied.
Yeah, it's terrible, isn't it? Barbara sends me a text from Berry. G'day, Barbara. Yeah, probably true. He was the CEO, Cook, so still responsible for everything that happened, and he was answerable for it. He was the skipper. That's probably true too, Doctor, yeah?
Yeah, look, I mean, Cook, even though he was a lieutenant, was in fact the captain. So he was in charge of navigating the ship. And when Banks said, go here, he was the one person who said, well, we can or we can't. But of course, overlying the Cook was, of course, the Admiralty and the Royal Society. So he had quite powerful bosses on top of him as well.
Yeah, John and Michael make this point, probably a fair point too. Would the spears exist today if they hadn't been taken and preserved in a museum in the UK?
Well, it's hard to tell.
No, it's hard to tell. It is,
there are spears that have been found in archaeological sites in places like, I'm trying to remember, in the Northern Territory that have just been sitting on the surface. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure whether that justifies their being stolen.
No, well, exactly, yeah.
I mean, but we're talking about a modern context rather than a 1770 context.
Yeah, that's right.
We need to always be aware of projecting our attitudes onto what people were doing in the 1770s.
Well, things were very different then. And honestly, I thought about it myself, you go overseas, I haven't been for a while, and you go to museums all over the world, and you see, particularly in Britain, and they've got some wonderful museums, and you see all of these artefacts, and you probably don't think about it very much, and then you think, well, they were taken, and maybe the people who originally owned them would love to have them back, or their ancestors, certainly.
Indeed, and I mean, a lot turns on the nature of the transaction, how the artefacts were given to people. There was a collection of artefacts, I think it was the Woolly collection that came back a few years ago, where the person had actually been an anthropologist and he had purchased and otherwise acquired significant material from the Aboriginal community in which he was living, and then later the community went and recovered the artefacts back from the museum. So that was, I think, probably an exchange rather than a theft.
Yes,
so you have to look at how the exchanges work, and also different concepts of ownership as well. And Britain has been notorious for holding some artefacts against the wishes of a lot of other people. The Elgin marbles come to mind. But in this case, I'm really glad this happened so easily. It was a bit of a struggle, but it's happened and it's great.
Yeah, can I ask you why it was so much of a struggle we've only got 4 so far. Why was it such a struggle?
Look, I think there's a natural possessiveness. I can recall in Victoria there was a case where there was a human remains collection, and Aboriginal communities went to the University of Melbourne, and the University of Melbourne said, well, what interest do you have in these? These are ours. And then a court case occurred, and the University of Melbourne went through a rapid education program about who owns human remains. And I think that's that changing attitudes, but attitudes get institutionally reinforced. So you have to go through the curators and the heads of the museums and all those sort of things. I think there's some interesting people working in the museums who to subvert that and to work very hard with communities. And I noticed Nick Thomas, who I think is an Australian, because I think I went on an archaeological excavation with him once when he was very junior. So, everybody's changed their attitudes, but there's still a lot of institutional things. And, of course, the Elgin marbles are a huge political issue rather than anything else.
Yeah, by the way, it was also said, my texters too, and it's worth relaying this to you, they're looking forward to sharing the artefacts with all Australians, but it's also said a big part of you wants to acknowledge the fact they were taken away, yes, but had they not been taken away, had they not been really carefully preserved and cared for by Trinity College, maybe they wouldn't exist today. So it's sort of 6 of one and half a dozen of the other, isn't it, Doctor?
Yeah, but I mean, Trinity never really put them on display. They were in the back rooms.
Oh, didn't they?
They had been to they had been to Australia before. I think they've been to Australia twice, where they had been displayed in Sydney. So a lot of these artefacts just sit in back rooms and old cupboards, rather than being interpreted and put on display for the community.
Well, gee, what's the point of that?
Well, yes. Indeed. A lot of museum curators who have to pay for the storage space are asking those questions as well.
Yeah. Julie in French's Forest wants to know if you know anything about the plaster cast moulds of the Indigenous people made as referenced in the book Paris Savages. Any attempt to get them back, and do you know about them? She thinks they're in a museum in France. Julie in French's Forest.
Yeah, look, I really don't know.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry?
No, that's okay. No, it's okay. And I'm just looking at some other texts here. These artefacts belong living cultures and are part of their cultural heritage right now and therefore should be returned. We still have so much to learn. Lyndall, yes, we do. Do you think it's the beginning? Do you think if we ask for more, Aboriginal people ask for more to be returned, that'll happen too?
Oh, definitely. I think the not only the Aboriginal people but the Australian government is quite positive towards this, and I think the museums also in the UK are also positive. They're trying to get a positive return, and they're trying to get some sort of connection with the Aboriginal communities themselves, so that there's an intellectual exchange as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it occurs to me too that, invaders, people who've colonised, have picked up stuff from so many countries over the years and taken it back home and put it in a museum. It'd be nice if it was back in the country of origin so those people could see it, wouldn't it?
Exactly, because, an airfare to the UK is pretty expensive and it's, hard to organise. And if the items aren't on display in the UK anyway, it's like you go there and see nothing. So it's better to have them here and often they're displayed in situations where you've got the context of the land and the people as well as just the artefacts.
Yeah, well, the important thing for us is, these four are coming back and the Perouse local Aboriginal Land Council really want them to be here so that we can see them, so that Australians can see them. And, that's the overriding point. They're Australian artefacts and they should be here.
Yeah. Subject to cultural conventions, because some artefacts are not suitable to be displayed to people for cultural reasons.
Yeah, sure.
And other artefacts, people used to put skulls everywhere, and that has changed quite dramatically,
and so
both in terms of Aboriginal burials and European burials.
Yeah, indeed. Julie's asking a good question. Is there anything we can do, me and the listeners, to agitate for the return of more of these items?
Well, I think there'll just be campaigns as they come along, but it's not such a bad thing to write to the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, Linda Burney, and say, it's a good idea. I'm President of the Royal Australian Historical Society, and we often write to ministers and politicians saying, actually, what you've done is a good thing. And the feedback is often quite important because they never really get letters saying this has been good. They usually get letters saying you've got to fix this or this is terrible. So being positive is also encourages people to speed this process along.
Yeah. Jamie, hi Jamie, in Winston Hills says, David Cameron was once asked, he must have been the Prime Minister at the time, if museums in Britain would be returning all of the artefacts they had in their possession that had been forcibly removed. His reply was very glib, well then there wouldn't be anything left. Well, that was the problem. But
that might be the case, and I don't necessarily.
No.
Again, it depends on how things were acquired, doesn't it?
Yes, that's right. It does.
And why things? Because sometimes people give things to museums because they want things to be preserved over a long time so that the community can see them. So there's that element as well. Museums are not all just robber barons.
No, I know.
Yeah.
Well, Jamie also makes the point, and it's pretty funny, Jamie, that we asked for the ashes to be returned 4 or 5 times. They wouldn't give them back.
No.
The cricket ashes, yeah, that's right. Well, look, you've cheered us up because, they are Australian. They're our First Nations people and they were taken from them and we've asked for them back. And finally, and I suppose will it, in dribs and drabs that these artefacts do come back? Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we've got to acknowledge the work of Ray Ingrey and Nolene Timbrey, Uncle Shane Williams, David Johnson, Rodney Mason, and the whole Gweagal community and the local Perouse local Aboriginal Land Council as being actors and really driving this process. So, what they've achieved is really fantastic.
It is. And one final point from Libby while I've got you on the phone. Weren't the spears being used around the time they were stolen? I doubt the Aboriginal people at the time were only interested in preserving them. They were using them, indeed.
Oh, absolutely, because they're recorded to have seaweed on them.
Yeah, right.
And that you have, actually, when you think about it, they took 40 spears. It was probably the whole collection of spears. The poor old Aboriginal people would have to have made new spears to replace the ones that were stolen.
Yeah.
It's like somebody stealing a car. they're probably quite important parts of their the day-to-day kit for living. So that's also important to note.
Yeah, then they moved on and did other things with their lives. Of course, Cook was gone in 1787. And as you say, I don't think Banks ever came back, did he, Joseph Banks?
No, I don't think Banks ever came. Oh, sorry, I know that Banks never came back.
Yeah.
But as I said before, he had quite an influence on the way New South Wales was settled.
Yeah, indeed. Gee, it was good to talk to you. Thanks very much for your time.
Okay, thanks a lot. See you later.
He's, as you said, president of the Historical Society and also the principal at Artefact. And you can look them up on, I think it's artefact.net.au. Don't take my word for that, and I'll confirm that with you. But yes, a few of you are making the extremely good point. They were stolen from them. They were using them at the time. And as Dr. Stuart just said, they'd have to make more so they could fish and they could hunt. So anyway, beginning of what we hope is a very good story for our Aboriginal people, particularly around the community of La Perouse.